What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Monday. You know what time it is. Time to get into those hot waiver ads as we head into week 7. I can't believe we're already 7 weeks into the fantasy season already. And when it comes to the waiver list for this upcoming week, I can say that in terms of sheer volume, this is the highest amount of players that we've ever included in a single waiver wire video. So for those of you needing to pick up players, if you look hard enough, you should find a player that fits right for your team. And just as a reminder, the threshold for players that are able to make it on the waiver wire list is they do have to be owned in under 60% of leagues. So while not everyone is going to be available in every league, at least you know on average 40% of you or more are able to get them off the waivers. Before we get into the video though, just a quick reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, want to support the channel, the best way to do that is simply by hitting that like button. And if you're new to the channel, maybe you have not yet subscribed, consider taking today as an opportunity to do so. Before we do get into all of the top ads of the week though, as per usual, we will begin with the stat of the day. And yesterday's stat of the day was which qualified quarterback boasts the league's worst completion percentage. This player heading into week 6 also ranked 3rd in the area of time to throw. The correct answer was actually Zach Wilson. Congratulations to Richard H, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at brich1982. Once again, congratulations to both of you, but as for today's stat of the day, through 6 weeks, which running back currently leads the league in the area of rushing yards over expectation? Once again, that's which running back through 6 weeks currently leads the league in rushing yards over expectation. If you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into it. And as per usual, we will begin with the running backs. At the top of this list, we have Alex Collins, running back and starter for the Seattle Seahawks. He is of course taking the place of the injured Chris Carson, who was placed on injured reserve last week. With Carson on the injured reserve, that is going to hold him out for a minimum of 3 weeks. That doesn't mean that he is going to automatically return as soon as he passes that minimum. At this point, the Seattle Seahawks haven't given us enough information to know exactly how long he's going to be out, but at minimum, Alex Collins is projected to be the starter for at least 2 more weeks. His next 2 matchups are against the New Orleans Saints and Jacksonville Jaguars. The Saints, definitely not a positive matchup, but Jacksonville, he should have a good game. And while of course the Seattle Seahawks don't have Russell Wilson leading this team from the quarterback position, with Geno Smith as the starting quarterback against Pittsburgh, another less than positive matchup, Alex Collins in a PPR league put up 16.8 PPR fantasy points. That was on the back of 20 rush attempts, over 100 rushing yards, even a rushing touchdown. So he did prove to us that even with Geno Smith starting, there is some value to be extracted. Currently, he is owned in many leagues, but still under 50% of leagues have him owned, coming in at about 46.6% ownership. So if you do see him available, he's definitely a player that I would prioritize on the waiver. That's why we do have him listed as the #1 running back. Moving into the next running back, we have J.D. McKissic of the Washington football team. This is going to be a running back that I think will rank first in many people's waiver lists, because in week 6 he's now coming off of a really dominant performance from the running back position, 19 PPR fantasy points, only 8 rush attempts on the ground, but very efficient with his touches. Those 8 rush attempts went for 45 rushing yards, an average of nearly 6 yards per carry, but where he does the majority of his work each and every week is in the receiving game, where he had 10 targets, 8 receptions, another 65 yards, so over 100 yards from scrimmage in total. One thing though that you do have to keep in mind if investing in J.D. McKissic is there was kind of a perfect storm of opportunity for him heading into this week. Terry McLaurin banged up, Curtis Samuel, he didn't play, Antonio Gibson, he is a bit hobbled as well, and as we know, Logan Thomas, he's also still on IR, so a lot of their playmakers, especially receivers, were not available for this contest, and with the running back ahead of him also injured, it was another factor increasing his overall opportunity share. So for J.D. McKissic, seeing a game like this may not happen for the remainder of the season, but if the Washington football team's receivers do not get healthy in the near future, then J.D. McKissic in the short term could continue to have a similar type of value. For that, I do think he is worth an extra look in PPR leagues or even half PPR leagues. But if you already have your starters locked up, maybe you have a running back 1, running back 2, and you're just looking for a complete upside play, then I would prioritize this 3rd running back. It's Rhamohdre Stevenson of the New England Patriots. While yes, Damian Harris is the starter for the New England Patriots, a running back that primarily gets all of his work off the ground, one thing that we know is that Damian Harris has had his struggles so far this season, and he's also had fumbling issues as well. So Rhamohdre Stevenson, a player that we saw completely shine in the preseason, he's now beginning to get opportunities. He saw 5 carries on the ground, averaging 4.6 yards per carry. In the receiving game, he saw 3 targets, catching all 3 of them for a very impressive 39 receiving yards. And much like he was doing in the preseason, him with a nose for the end zone, he did also score a rushing touchdown as well. His volume, while he only did receive 8 touches, what he was able to do with it was very promising. So if Damien Harris does continue to struggle, I wouldn't be surprised if Rhamohdre Stevenson not only does earn more opportunities, I think he already did that, but there is a chance that he does surpass Damien Harris on the depth chart, and we cannot forget that Damien Harris also comes with some injury concerns himself. Behind Stevenson, though, we do have Michael Carter of the New York Jets, who is on bye week this week, so there isn't any news that I do have to break to you. But just as a reminder, Michael Carter is coming off of 2 consecutive games where he scored a rushing touchdown. He has also had 3 targets in his last 4 consecutive games that work in the receiving game, giving him somewhat of a floor, but with him being on the New York Jets, the upside can be called into question. Even with that being said, though, it is difficult to find running backs that are getting consistent volume each and every week, especially ones that you can find on the waiver wire. Currently, Michael Carter owned in just over 50% of leagues, so he's not widely available, but with him being on a bye week last week, maybe teams that needed to make a spot to fill an open spot in their starting lineup this week, then it's quite possible that somebody could have dropped Michael Carter, in which case take a look for him on the waiver wire. I don't think many people will be going out of their way to find him. He had no production last week because he was on bye, so this could be a player going slightly under the radar. The next 2 players we have are very interesting. They're going to be the Cleveland Browns running backs, starting with the one I think would hold the most value. That's going to be D'Ernest Johnson. While Johnson only got 1 rush attempt on the ground and 1 target and 1 reception last week, one thing that we did know is that Nick Chubb was ruled out. Kareem Hunt did also get injured, and while his injury status is largely unknown at this point, if one or possibly both of those running backs is unable to suit up next week, a game that's not a positive matchup, it is going to be against the Denver Broncos, then these 2 players are going to have immense value. D'Ernest Johnson would be the favorite, in my opinion, to lead this team from the running back position if there is no Kareem Hunt or Nick Chubb. At this point, though, the reason I don't have them ranked higher is because we really don't know at this point. It's also not a positive matchup, as I had mentioned. Regardless, though, there is still some time before waivers do open up, so this is going to be a situation to monitor. We will also update this on our waiver wire section on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. You can check that out in the description if you want an update. Maybe you're watching this video on Tuesday. So if we get news that either Kareem Hunt or Nick Chubb is going to miss some time, Johnson and Felton will easily shoot up our waiver wire rankings. Each running back that I did list up to this point has had some immediate value, but some players that are more long shots but are more widely available in all leagues. I'd consider these 2 players more of dart throws, but if you're in a deeper league, they're widely available. To start, we have Rashaad Penny of the Seattle Seahawks, and I understand that Rashaad Penny has not been healthy for hardly any games since he's been drafted by the team, but we do have to recognize that he is a first-round pick. Seattle has never cut him throughout his 4-year span of dealing with injuries. This is also his final year on contract with Seattle, so they are going to be invested in trying to see what they can get out of him. And with him now being able to practice and Chris Carson being on the IR, this is the perfect time for them to start to get him involved. We already know that DJ Dallas and Travis Homer were players that were receiving volume even in this last game, a clear indication that they're not 100% committed to Alex Collins. So when you factor all of those things in, taking a dart throw on Rashaad Penny, a player that you can add, keep him on the bench, and if he gets injured again, just drop him next week when you do need to add another player, it's of course going to have a low percentage of success, but still a dart throw that could pay off nonetheless. Then moving into the final player we have at the running back position on our waiver wire list this week, the final dart throw, that's going to be Tarik Cohen of the Chicago Bears. As we know, he is the receiving running back, or has been the receiving running back for the Chicago Bears in recent years. He's had a bit of an up and down career, and to start this season, he was put on the PUP, but with 6 weeks now having already passed, he is now eligible to begin practicing. At this point, we have no news on whether that's going to happen or not, but if Cohen is healthy enough to begin to play, suit up, and step on the field, this is going to be the time that he is first eligible. At this time, I don't think many people are talking about him. There's no updates on him on Sleeper, so to say he's flying under the radar would be an understatement. Just keep in mind, we're not sure how much upside he would even have in this offense or what type of workload he would get right out of the gate, but if you're desperate or in a deeper league, maybe you look in Tarik Cohen's direction before everybody else catches on. Okay guys, forgive me, I did think that he was the last player, but looking at my notes, I do have one more. But hey, who's going to argue with having an additional player? But this is definitely in the same wheelhouse. It's going to be Jeff Wilson Jr. of the San Francisco 49ers. How you would rank these final 3 players, Rashaad Penny, Jeff Wilson Jr., and Tarik Cohen, I think you could mix and match them all, but it's a very similar situation. Jeff Wilson Jr. now able to come back from his injury. At this point, we don't have updates on him either, but with the San Francisco 49ers backfield having questionable talent as is, is, then Jeff Wilson Jr., a player who has produced, it's quite possible that when he does return, he could have an opportunity to step in atop the depth chart. So once again, similarly to Tarik Cohen, adding him now could be your best opportunity to get ahead of your league mates. Alright guys, we're moving over to the wide receiver position, and yet again we do have a ton of names for you, but many of which you've already heard in previous weeks. And starting up at the top, a player that we've mentioned for several of the last weeks, Tim Patrick of the Denver Broncos. Believe it or not, Tim Patrick is still available in about 60% of leagues. His ownership in ESPN comes in at 40.4%. To me, that completely blows my mind, and every week since week 1, so now 6 weeks deep into this season, he scored double-digit fantasy points in all games but one. Against the Las Vegas Raiders, he had 3 receptions, 42 yards, catching his 3rd receiving touchdown of the season. And as it stands, he's currently the wide receiver 30 in PPR leagues, the wide receiver 27 in standard. He's continued to produce, and while he hasn't had many high upside games, the most fantasy points he's ever scored in a single contest this season has been 15.9 PPR fantasy points. But at the same time, he really hasn't busted. As mentioned, double-digit fantasy points in 5 of 6 weeks. In his worst game of the season, 6.9 points. The next wide receiver target we have is someone who could drop in my waiver wire rankings when I put together the list and upload it to the website. That's going to be T.Y. Hilton of the Indianapolis Colts. This was, of course, his first game back of the season. And in week 6 against Houston, he scored 12 total points on the back of 4 receptions for 80 yards. That was on 4 targets, so a 100% catch rate so far this year. Small sample, but it does show very promising upside for his connection he could possibly have with Carson Wentz. As we know, Michael Pittman has been the leading receiver for this team, especially from a volume perspective, but with T.Y. Hilton not requiring a ton of volume, him being able to put up 12 points on a mere 4 targets, those are numbers that not every receiver can replicate without a touchdown, but T.Y. Hilton in his first game back, that's something he was able to do. His age, health, and availability, though, can be called into question, so that's why I said that when I put together the waiver list, he may drop in the rankings, but regardless of that, I still do feel that he's going to be a high target on many people's waiver wire list this week. Behind him, we have Darnell Mooney, and this is the player that when I was looking at this list, I really think he should have been listed ahead of T.Y. Hilton. For those of you that don't know, Darnell Mooney posted his second best game of the season, coming in with 15.5 PPR fantasy points. That was on the back of 8 targets, so tying his season high in that aspect. I know overall we can't be all that excited about the weapons in Chicago with Justin Fields starting. He really hasn't shown that much upside, and in the passing game especially, there hasn't been a ton of volume. Preferably, this team would like to run it as much as possible, but with Darnell Mooney looking like the best receiver in Chicago, at least at this point, or at least being the leading receiver up to this point, I can understand making an argument for not starting him, but at this point, he really needs to be owned in all leagues. Currently, he's owned in about 46% of leagues, coming in at 45.9% ownership in ESPN. So widely available for you guys out there. There is hope, of course, that this team does improve offensively, and if they do, Darnell Mooney leading this team from a receiver standpoint, he has the most to gain. Behind him, another player I'm not going to spend too much time on, but it's Christian Kirk of the Arizona Cardinals. In addition to Christian Kirk, you could throw AJ Green's name into this hat, and we all know the story with these Arizona Cardinals receivers behind DeAndre Hopkins. I'm speaking, of course, of Rondale Jones, the aforementioned AJ Green, and Christian Kirk. They're going to have good games. This is a phenomenal offense, but guessing when their good games are going to come has been extremely difficult and virtually impossible. And the unfortunate fact is that when they're not posting explosive performances, they're usually posting complete duds. Regardless, the production does warrant an ad, and maybe if you're hit with bye weeks, suffer some injuries, need to put in a high upside player, Christian Kirk, AJ Green, those could be players that you possibly look to. Moving into one of the most intriguing players we have on this entire waiver list, we have Donovan Peoples-Jones of the Cleveland Browns. He's, of course, coming off of a phenomenal performance, 101 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Overall, he scored 26.1 points in a PPR format. This game and this production already coming after a 70-yard performance the week before against the LA Chargers. The only concern that I have is that was only on 11 targets through those 2 games. 5 targets this week, 6 targets the week before, which isn't a high volume total, but the production does warrant an ad. I do question his season long value or how consistently he will play from this point forward, which is why I can't rank him much higher. When you also factor in that Jarvis Landry will be returning at some point, it is fair to wonder if this could possibly be a trap, or if we get caught chasing fantasy points only for him to put up a dud. Maybe his best weeks could possibly be behind him, but 26 fantasy points is no laughing matter. It's not something we find on waiver wire each and every week, so if you do want to look in his direction, I don't blame you one bit. Just keep in mind that half of his production did come on a Hail Mary to close out the first half. Alright guys, now moving into the final wide receiver, this is a name that was on the waiver wire list to start the season. This is KJ Osborn of the Minnesota Vikings. Osborn, of course, starting off very hot. He had a receiving touchdown, 167 receiving yards through the first 2 weeks of the season, playing consistently in both games. This had, of course, caused him to be a hot waiver ad after the first 2 weeks, but unfortunately since then his production did fall off a cliff. We're talking no more than 6.6 fantasy points in any of the 3 contests after that, but he did have a bit of a revival, having 7 targets this past week against Carolina, putting up 78 receiving yards, even scoring his second receiving touchdown of the season. Currently, they're heading into a bye week this week, so if you grab him, you're not going to be able to start him, and when it comes to guessing what his production's going to be, it looks like that's going to be a difficult endeavor. Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, they still both remain healthy and much more heavily involved in this offense than he, but regardless, on the season, he's the wide receiver 36 in PPR leagues, the wide receiver 35 in standard, which may sound very similar to a player like Tim Patrick, but the reason Tim Patrick is at the top of this list and KJ Osborn is at the bottom is because guessing the production and having consistency is something I value much more than the end result. Alright guys, that's going to do it for wide receivers, but we do have a few good tight ends to go over. Starting this list, we have Ricky Seals-Jones of the Washington football team. As I had mentioned when we were discussing JD McKissic and his value, what we know is that the receivers on the Washington football team have been absolutely decimated. So Ricky Seals-Jones, the tight end taking over for the injured Logan Thomas, still currently on IR, he now came off of his best performance of the season, 15.8 PPR fantasy points. That was on the back of 6 targets, 4 receptions, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But when it comes to Ricky Seals-Jones, I quite possibly believe that this is going to be a player that until Logan Thomas comes back, you could trust in your lineup each and every week. Now, I would take that back, of course, if Logan Thomas came off the IR and returned to the lineup, and also maybe if some of their other receivers did come back from being injured. But as it stands today, they're still desperate for playmakers. Ricky Seals-Jones has been playing pretty well in place of Logan Thomas, so I do think he will continue to see targets in this offense. And when it comes to the tight end position, finding a tight end that's consistently involved in any offense is not easy to do, especially for ones on waiver wire. So if you're somebody out there looking for a tight end that you can trust, maybe you look in Ricky Seals' direction this week. Another tight end that's been flying a bit under the radar is our next tight end. That's Alie-Cox of the Indianapolis Colts. I definitely would have a pretty sizable gap between him and Ricky Seals-Jones when it comes to priority on the waiver wire. Alie-Cox saw 5 targets in week 4, but has regressed since, seeing 4 targets in week 5, now 3 targets in week 6. He has caught 3 receiving touchdowns through that span, 2 of them in week 4 against Miami, his 3rd touchdown now against Houston, his 3rd of the season. And while yes, his target market share has not been extremely high, one thing we know about tight ends is mostly their touchdown or bust. Alie-Cox up until this point has proven to be a consistent weapon that Carson Wentz looks to in that area of the field. So despite having low targets overall and a low snap share, that doesn't mean that he can't continue to have value, although I would consider him much more risky of a start each week. The final tight end we have is O.J. Howard of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and this is going to be a tight end that I think a lot of people will have listed higher on their waiver rankings. When compared to both of these tight ends, he actually put in the best performance last week with 6 receptions, 49 yards, and a receiving touchdown, coming in with 16.9 PPR fantasy points. Now, my main issue with him and the reason he's not ranked higher is because Rob Gronkowski is still a thing. Yes, he's injured, but he will be returning soon, and when he does, I find it hard to believe that O.J. Howard will be able to retain any type of value or startability. So for that, yes, he's worth a speculative add, and if Rob Gronkowski remains out, maybe you take a shot on him. I don't know about trusting him in your starting lineup, but owning him in the off chance that Rob Gronkowski re-aggravates an injury or takes longer to return to the field than we expect, in that case, I think that ad is going to pay off. Outside of that situation, though, I really don't think he's going to have much long-term value. Alright guys, moving over to the quarterback position, and to lead this list, we have none other than Kirk Cousins. I myself was a bit surprised to see his ownership so low. Right now, he's owned in about 45.5% of leagues. That ranking was despite him being the quarterback 13 heading into this week. Obviously, he's going to be ranked much higher now after this explosive performance, posting nearly 26 fantasy points, his best performance of the season, but I can't be all that surprised as he was coming off of 2 stinkers, 10 fantasy points against Cleveland in week 4, 13 fantasy points against Detroit, which was looked at as a very positive matchup. But even with that, we know that this 26-point performance is not completely out of the realm of possibility for Kirk Cousins. Of course, he did start off the season red hot, 22 fantasy points in week 1, followed that up with 25 in weeks 2 and 3. So for those of you out there that aren't getting the production you want out of your quarterback, Kirk Cousins, he may not be consistent each and every week. Of course, he's a pocket passer, so the floor for him is going to be much lower than that of rushing quarterbacks, meaning you'll get these 26-point fantasy days, but you're also going to have games like Cleveland, like Detroit, where he does post under 15 fantasy points. If you can take the good with the bad, you're likely to get paid off in the end. Just keep in mind, if you're looking for a quarterback this week, he is heading into a week 7 bye. The final quarterback target I do have for you this week is going to be Sam Darnold of the Carolina Panthers. No, he's not coming off of his best game. In fact, this was his second worst performance, his worst performance being just 2 weeks ago against Philadelphia. But heading into week 7 and week 8, he has positive matchups against the New York Giants and Atlanta Falcons, so it's very possible he could bounce back. We've seen him post 25-point fantasy days against a team like Houston, even a 31-point game just 3 weeks ago against Dallas. So if you're looking for a quarterback that does have some sneaky upside, Sam Darnold definitely does, especially in these 2 matchups. And with him now having 2 of his worst performances in back-to-back weeks, I wouldn't be surprised if he hits waivers almost everywhere. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.